Hey guys, all right, so let's pick back up and finish up with our American Revolution. So we ended yesterday with the Declaration of Independence, formally and officially being sent, that said we are no longer the British colonies, we are the United States of America, we are our own country, which is why we shoot off all the fireworks on July 4th, because we are celebrating the day that we became a country. So when the American Revolution begins, that means officially there is a war, and it is the United States of America versus Great Britain. Now, I want to make sure we understand, because this always stuck out to me the first time that I learned it, because it's really not the way that history is taught to you. There were roughly 2.6 million people living in the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Please understand, only a third of that population actually participated in the American Revolution, and a third of that population didn't want the revolution to be happening in the first place. They wanted to stay as colonies of Great Britain. They didn't even want to break away. So where we can really, paint this time in history with beautiful patriotic views at the same time, it really is funny to think that there were people living in the United States, living in the colonies, who didn't want this to happen at all, who were angry that this was starting, who was angry that there was a war going on, that did not want the United States of America to exist. And we don't really talk about that when we learn about this. And so it's kind of funny to think about that. So once again, a patriot is for the breakaway, and a loyalist wants to stay as a colony to the king. The Continental Army. So also George Washington only had about 20,000 troops in his army at one time. It was very small. They were always short on supplies. They were very rarely paid. It was a ragtag group of men. There were a lot of convicts that were in that group. I'm not saying convicts are bad people at all, but there was a lot of people who got out of prison so they could fight the war, because they were just willing to get any warm body that they could to come fight this. Most men had to return home in between fighting to support their farms. People were floating in and out. This was certainly just not an organized military fighting force that the British had. And clearly Continental Army was not that way. The Loyalists and the Tories. The Tory is another nickname for a loyalist. Those are colonists who support the British and they want to remain loyal to the king. There was about 60,000 colonists who actually fight alongside the British Army to help them during this conflict. And the Native Americans actually sided with the British because the British promised that they would stop the United States from expanding onto their territory. So Native Americans helped the British, which is comical because the British caused all of the problems for the Native Americans in the first place. All right, so 1775 to 1777, it is not going well for the colonists. The majority of the American Revolution, please understand, the Continental Army was getting their butt whooped. The British certainly were way better at fighting than the Continental Army. They had way more money, way more supplies. It just certainly was not as good. The Continental Army was not as good as the British Army. So the army's getting beat. Ports are shutting down, which means there's no business, no supplies getting in. Goods are very scarce. They made continental dollars because, if they were breaking away from Great Britain, they couldn't use British money. So they printed off paper money, and the paper money's worthless because it's just a piece of paper. There was no gold or silver that was backing the value of it. Washington's troops barely survived the winter, camping at Valley Forge, which is in Pennsylvania. And if you would watch this video as well, there's some very interesting things about how smallpox went through, how everyone was dying of dysentery, how he came up with inoculation for smallpox. Fun fact, they ran out of food. People were eating dogs. There's just a whole lot of interesting information if you watch that. But that was the campsite through the winter, since there was no fighting happening that winter, of Valley Forge. But it really just shows kind of how ill prepared the Continental Army was to even be an organized army. The turning point of the American Revolution. And that's why whenever you learn wars, you always learn about the turning point. The turning point was the Battle of Saratoga up in New York. And the reason this is the turning point is because it is one of the first time the colonists get an actual win. The first time the Continental Army, the U.S. of A, wins a battle. And because they win this battle, they convince the powerful country of France to help them, to join in on this fight. France wants to weaken their enemy of Great Britain. It's not that they're necessarily fighting because they want America to be their own country. They just don't want Great Britain to be as powerful of a country. So they join in the fight to help weaken Great Britain. And because it looks like maybe the United States has a shot of beating Great Britain. Without France's support, please know America probably would have lost. So we owe a great deal to France for helping us out. The Battle of Yorktown is the last major battle, and it is famous because at this battle, General Charles Cornwallis surrenders, who was the head of the British military. And so the United States, they win. Like, the Yorktown is the deciding factor. They win. There's your celebratory dance right there. At the end of the war, what ends the war is a treaty. So the United States and Great Britain officially signed the Treaty of Paris. Obviously, it's signed in Paris, France. Great Britain recognizes the United States of America as its own country, and it is decided that the Mississippi River is the boundary of the newly formed country. If you remember, the Mississippi River should have been the boundary after the French and Indian War, until King George said the Proclamation of 1763 drew that red line that said the colonists couldn't pass that area. So this Ohio River Valley is all up for grabs, and all of this territory is now going to be settled and made part of the United States of America. The Articles of Confederation, this is during the Revolutionary War, during this time of fighting it. This was the first attempt at an organized government that was used during the Revolutionary War. It does help the U.S. win the war. It dealt with land issues, but it's really not enough. The Articles of Confederation really proved that we do not have an organized enough government to be our own country, so we're going to have to fix that. It does not solve the issue of state power versus federal power. Like, you can't raise taxes. There's no way of collecting taxes from the states. And the United States had this huge war debt from the Revolutionary War. We had borrowed money from other countries, and now we couldn't pay that money back because we couldn't raise tax money to pay those countries back. So it made us look really bad because we couldn't pay our debts to other countries. The other thing it did was it highlighted domestic problems, such as Shays' Rebellion, which, please, once again, got a little video, watch that. Shays' Rebellion was all about a guy named Daniel Shays. He had fought, and this is like where this guy's got a point. He fought in the American Revolution. He gave up, risked his life to fight for this country, and was never paid for his service. And he lost his farm because while he was off fighting, he clearly wasn't making money off of his farm. So the bank foreclosed on his farm and took his property from him. So he has no money from being paid from being in the military. The dude lost his farm, which he wouldn't have lost if he wouldn't have been a soldier. And so he's super ticked off. So he gets a bunch of guys together, a bunch of farmers, and they lead a revolt. And he has probably, in my opinion, every right to lead this revolt because that's so terrible of what happened to him. The Articles of Confederation are showing, this really shows that the issues that it has. Shays' Rebellion highlights how the Articles of Confederation are not going to work. And so Shays' Rebellion forces us to redraft a new form of government, a new idea of how this country is going to be run, and that is going to be the American Constitution that we still use today. So new country, now what? We are no longer a colony, a group of colonies. We're independent states. Every state wants their own independent state government, but we have to figure out how we're going to have independent state governments and a federal government. Please note at this point, voting, only white males who own property are allowed to vote, which is an issue. Shout out to the ladies. All right. Please know, without women, the Revolutionary War definitely would have not gone the way that it did. Women worked in military camps as nurses and cooks. They kept things moving for the war effort. But also, please know, there were several women who fought in the war, like Molly Pitcher famously took her husband's place after he died. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and fought for a year, like Joan of Arc and Mulan situation. Women kept the economy running because, when their husbands were off at war, they kept the family farm going or they kept the business going. Whatever it was, they kept the economy running while men were off fighting. And yet they still remain second-class citizens. And this is an area of contention as well, because obviously the Declaration of Independence leaves out women, as it also leaves out any person of color. So the elephant in the room. Slavery is the elephant in the Revolutionary room, is what I'm writing right there. So the Revolutionary War officially started with the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson, a man who owned slaves, penned the famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Well, if all men are created equal, men and women are created equal, then we wouldn't have an institution of slavery in the United States. But there was an institution of slavery. This country was formed on the ideal of freedom, but it is kind of a hypocrisy in itself when it is an ideal of freedom when it held men, women, and children in bondage. The southern colonies and now states believed slave labor was essential to their economies, which remember they had plantation agriculture, very large agricultural farms that did cotton and tobacco and indigo, rice. They required a huge amount of labor, and they wanted the plantation owners wanted it to be cheap labor, which they used slave labor, even though actually having paid workers is economically better than having slaves, but that's besides the fact. Many use Christianity to justify the practice of slavery, and that is something else that is a hypocritical tendency. And it will take less than a century for this crisis in conscience to come to the forefront of the newly formed United States of America. Remember, we become the United States in 1776, and your Civil War will break out in 1861. Really, 1860, you can even argue that it's well on its way. So less than 100 years, and this will be right again at the forefront. All right, so we have covered the American Revolution, hit the high points. Obviously, there's way more to this than what we are giving you right here. And I certainly hope, if you start watching some of those YouTube videos that I've linked for you, maybe go down the rabbit hole and learn a little more, because this is a fascinating time period to study, not only because, yes, it is very good to know the history of the country that you live in, but also just know your facts, especially in the climate that we're in today. It's really good to know your history. It's really good to know your history. Okay. Not just because you need to be proud of it. You need to know it so that you can point out where changes need to be made. I leave you with that. Thanks, guys.